Recording.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for having me for a second CLM in 2 weeks. I appreciate it as I'm a little bit behind the curve in contributing, so appreciate the opportunity. Today is actually a presentation I gave in Stuttgart, Germany, and it's an odd story of how I got there, which I think needs to be memorialized because it's the case of good outcomes from bad intentions. My intention of volunteering time at, it wasn't necessarily a bad intention, but the intention was I would volunteer 10 hours of time at the System Dynamics Society conference, and they could put that in the raffle for the student raffle. I figured they would, you know, increase the funds. It would be good for the student chapter, and I got all sorts of, you know, professors saying they'd have me stack wood or move furniture, and it was intended to be modeling support. But, you know, and it was actually kind of funny. John Sturman came by and had a great comment where he's like, what is this Tim modeling time? And they said, well, if you need help with your models, he can help you for 10 hours. And he very graciously said, Tim's doing a dissertation. He doesn't have time for 10 hours. So that was a good thing. But what happened was the guy who won it, Ivan Dula, is a student at Stuttgart. And actually their 10 hours, they requested I fly out and give 10 hours of presentation, workshop, and lessons, or not lessons, but dialogue and presentations on the work I was doing. And so I ended up going out in November for a good week and presenting across 2 days at the Stuttgart University. And this is one of those presentations, and I wanted to share it because I think it's an important topic and it's been discussed a little bit. But the original audience of this topic was not just system dynamicists. It was analytics and engineers within the general business group of the university, all the graduates. They had kind of an open lunch session where I gave this presentation. So just a good outcome. If you volunteer something for the student chapter, you too can get flown to Germany and give a presentation, though no guarantees on that. But it was a good story. So thank you for having me today.
Tim, I think this was good intention plus innovation.
Exactly, and, very innovative.
And donating a prize for that raffle. So thank you. I think this sets a really good example.
Well, I spent a lot of time at the conference helping people who you could tell they'd bang their head against a model for 40 hours and were just frustrated. And if you look at it, you could maybe solve it in 5 minutes or half hour. But so I figured 10 hours would help. But yeah, I hope more people do that where they donate some support time. But the topic today is about ethics and prescriptive analytics. And it was interesting. I asked in Germany for everyone to raise their hand who had a actual class on ethics relating to engineering, modeling, data analytics, and no students raised their hand. The professors kind of looked awkwardly at one another. And so I'm going to ask the same question here to WPI. Is there a WPI class on campus that deals with ethics from an engineering or analytical standpoint rather than just a philosophical standpoint? Is there anything like that on campus here at WPI?
I'm sure there's a woman below us in this building who does ethics.
So they do have a class offering, or is it just that's her specialty?
Yeah, I think she's some humanities person. I remember talking to her.
Yeah, they have philosophers in humanities they look at technology, ethics stuff. I know historically around here. I don't know specifically about engineering ethics.
Well, so the push here is to get at least a discussion of ethics in a prescriptive analytics space, a data science space, a simulation space. And it's not a course or a class necessarily at this point, but I think it's important. And there will be a couple sources here I'll point out that I've drawn from that are making this. But if you think about the 4 kinds of analytics, and this is from Gartner, the broad kinds, there's descriptive analytics, what happened, diagnostic analytics, why did it happen, predictive analytics, what will happen. These types of things that we've done the majority of our analysis on for the last 60 years don't have the same kind of they have ethical implications, but when we get to prescriptive analytics, that's saying, what should we do? We're asking the analysis to help us make a decision and put in place a policy or a procedure or a new change or a strategy. And this really does have an ethical implication that I think is a lot higher than some of these other forms of analysis. When you're modeling conflict in policing, these ethics become even more important because people can suffer harm from the policies you recommend. There could be deaths or injuries or imprisonment, but people may suffer harm from the policies you don't recommend. If you sort of advocate against a policy being adopted, and that was a type 2 error that allowed someone to commit a bad act, the feedback effects of that can be very severe. And the feedback effects may result in that case of making the problem substantially worse. And so there is a real ethical consideration when it comes to this, not just to society, but to yourself, because there's the case law here is very murky, but there's certainly potential legal, moral, and reputational liabilities for the client using the model, as well as yourself. And I have cases in the back. I don't think we'll have time to get to the cases, but one of the cases is modeling of a consulting firm for a country that was misused, and they suffered reputational liability. But again, assuming the ground is sort of clean slate, what are the ethical frameworks? This is a thing that for me was interesting because I never had them laid out and said, here are 3 different ethical frameworks to view analysis from. The consequentialist perspective is the consequence of actions are from the basis of valid moral judgment about those actions. So we look at what happened, and that's how we assign virtue. Deontological, which I may be mispronouncing because it's a hard word, but this is the goodness or badness of actions is not determined by the consequences, but is an inherent property of the action. So it's a rules-based perspective of virtue. And virtue ethics are, rather than the actions or consequence, it's the goodness or badness as attributes of the agent. So the person doing the modeling has the ethical perspective. And this comes from a paper that sources at the bottom, and I have a bibliography at the end. So these 3 ethical frameworks all look at the same problem in very different ways. How do they translate into prescriptive analytics? Consequentialist is what will be the ultimate outcome of policies recommended. This is a really big thing for simulation because we know that a policy implemented isn't just, well, it's done, walk away, it's going to do what we want. We know there are ripple effects and unintended consequences and actions. Deontological is what is the proper suite of rules to apply to modeling. There's a question I pulled from Erica Palmer's work, as well as Eric Pruitt's. Are we scientists or engineers? What are the rules we follow when doing modeling to ensure we're doing it in an ethical way? And virtue is what are the ethical obligations of the analyst? What do we have as modelers a responsibility for?
Can I interrupt you, Tim? Just
absolutely. Absolutely.
This is the brain fires, so don't forget. Jay always told us that in system dynamics, we were not scientists. That we were, system dynamics was not a science, it was a profession, like medicine or law. Of course, doctors and lawyers have Hippocratic oaths and stuff like that, the canons the lawyers have to follow to behave ethically. And so that's one thing that triggers in my mind. And in a sort of a parallel vein, the economics profession has recently come up, the American Economic Association, with a code of ethics for economists. You know, the idea is like, you know, like a doctor, first do no harm to the economy, this sort of thing. So I think what you're trying to do here is in harmony with what other professions are, you know, trying to do. You know, law and medicine are, you know, sort of the traditional benchmarks, so to speak. And I think you're raising really good questions here.
Yeah. Thank you. The question of scientists or engineers has a additional perspective too that I'll get to in a couple of slides, but it's a really important question because it asks, are we a profession that has a code of ethics? Do we have, what are we pursuing and why are we doing it? These are all wrapped in this question, and it was surprising to me because I hadn't come across it before. Are we scientists or are we engineers?
And so Tim, I could, it's just to touch on the medical side of it. I mean, I've touched on some of the decision making. There are like some frameworks that we have to use, and it comes from a risk perspective, and then someone has to do risk benefit analysis. So it's some of the traditional stuff, but there are some stuff that we go through. I mean, almost daily. We talk about you know, how we use our medical technology. You know, we've got some very sick patients, and there's danger inherent in the technology. It's just the application technology, but these are sick patients, and they'll, you know, obviously receive some benefit.
As a question though, does that discussion go over to the business side or the administrative side with a business intelligence, which may not be about a medical application or medical device or medical technology? Are they asking those ethical questions when it comes to analysis on billing practices, bed optimization, things like that they're asking almost from a business side?
Yeah, there are people that will look at those are people that it's called the health economics outcomes research epidemiology people touch upon some of that stuff. So so there are some of these challenges because you have requirements to this framework. You have to go like it's called AFAP. It used to be called ALAR, as far as possible, and it basically has an incentivization. There's an interesting the risk perspective from the health agencies is that you will mitigate risk, no matter if it's until as far as possible at basically unlimited resources, which is in conflict with the business practices. So there are some interesting things. I don't think a lot of the people in general are thinking about that, but there are people at this leadership level that are making those decisions. So
yep. Well, hopefully this framework will be these things, the questions I'm talking about, and some of the perspectives and looks at this will be applicable in some of the work you're doing, or there may be better ideas from what you're doing to bring in.
I suggested I think this is very interesting, but I'm also saying that maybe I'll have some opportunity to give some. I got people in the domain specifically that potentially talk to you and maybe add a perspective on it.
Well, and part of this is not just for me. Part of this is to have a discussion in the community of modelers too. So if there is someone from a medical perspective, I think it would be really good to have them talk to a group of simulation scientists or a group of engineers, not just myself.
Yeah, I listened to the last day. I know you got this up, but just a gentleman from the Media Lab at MIT yesterday presented to us. He was invited to my company, Joe Ito. I've heard him before, really good. And he talked about some very interesting with artificial intelligence, some of the hazards associated with it in terms of its driving decision making, and it can be very disastrous.
Yep. Good. So, how do you, from a consequentialist standpoint, right? How do you account for systemic biases? This is something we talk about a little bit, but you capture the systemic biases and prejudice system you are about to work in. If you are modeling a society, you have to understand if the data you're using has a historical bias within it, not statistical bias or skew, but an actual systemic prejudice or something like that that's going to be reflected in the data. And you have to rigorously question both your own and others' data collections and theories. A big case example of this comes from the analysis that's done in recidivism, where they found that they were using not AI, but sort of analysis to help speed across decisions of, do we release this prisoner on parole or don't we? And what they found is that the analysis they were doing was systemically biased because of the prejudices within the prison practices going back over the time they'd look at the data. And you have to consider the implications of systemic biases in policies before you test. For example, gun control has a massive disparity in it that I've talked about, where it's disparate on blacks and Hispanics suffer probably 70-something% of the prosecutions, but only make up some 28% of the population. Yet the people advocating for more laws may not be aware of that bias and prejudice, and the analysis, if it doesn't capture that, may say, well, more gun control is good to keep white kids from shooting up schools, but it's not necessarily the white kids who are being brought before the courts and necessarily in the law enforcement. So these are some implications to consider from a consequentialist standpoint before you go running out. And this is from Turnley. Turnley came in the winter camp in 2015 and had a great presentation. And she said, beware data bearing gifts, right? When you use someone else's data, did you collect it yourself? Or if you didn't, who collected it? She was talking about Gallup in Pakistan and talking about interviewing folks in Afghanistan. Well, what are the biases at play there? What is the potential influences of the questions being asked and the data being collected? These are things to consciously think about and inform yourself before you necessarily make modeling decisions on them. Policy design from a consequentialist standpoint, I'm borrowing a little bit here from the Jay Forrester, George Richardson, Khalid Said, school, which is articulate your policy design experiments not as a random parameter that just gets adjusted mathematically, but describe it as a real-world plausible interventions within the power of the agents you're analyzing. When I'm looking at ISIS, I'm not saying, well, if magically something happened, if I'm a commander of a U.S. coalition force, what are the levers I can pull, and how do those levers, can I arrange them in such a way to accomplish the result? And you have to test the momentum solutions, test them in hypothetical best cases. Say, look, this is the politically popular one. Here's it as best case scenario. And if it doesn't work in the hypothetical best case, it's probably not going to work in an operationally constrained way either. We found this out with some of the solutions that were being passed around to, eliminating ISIS was kind of fanciful thinking. We tested it, giving it every benefit of the doubt, and it still didn't work. And obviously, we kind of get this, but policies should be tested in isolation, combination, and at different timing windows. Use falsification. Have a falsified policy to ensure that you're not including some confounding variable in your policy solution. Make sure you've isolated what's correct as best you can. And then use the sensitivity test to explore the policy space. But never rely on these absent real-world descriptions. I see a lot of use of sensitivity that says, oh, if this parameter goes up by 0.5 and this one moves by 0.2, but it's never articulated in what that means from an actual implementation.
What's falsification?
So falsification, for example, we found a policy in intervening with emerging state actors that combined an intervention of three parts, three components. And to make sure, and it involved a timing window. And so we tested each one of the key components, the timing window, and each of those three components in isolation to see, are we just missing this effect because we're attributing this combination to what's really a single effect. So we created tests that would basically say, it would try and falsify our findings. And it's in the article. There's a link to the article on the WPI website, I think. But it describes this falsification test. We found that no, it has to be all four in combination because no single or double effort had a similar beneficial effect.
Okay, so it's like negative test. It sounds like similar to, which often gets overlooked in software testing, usually generates a lot of holes, is negative, good, strong negative testing. Positive testing is typically easier. Negative testing is.
Well, if you think about policy as something that can be falsified, if I'm going to deploy a policy and you think, what would be the opposite of that policy? Can I get a similar effect? Or what would be the falsification? These are just parts of the test that should be done. And then use generative theory development. We have simulations, let's use them. Run one suite, learn from it, run another suite, learn from that, iteratively test these. Switching quickly to deontological, do you operate from first principles? And this gets to what Mike was saying, sometimes first principles are given to you, first do no harm. But if you're studying conflict, we kind of can't do that. So our version is first do no harm that wasn't intended. But there are a deontological approach to ethics is to think about the rules by which you are conducting this analysis, or only model within policies that adhere to domestic or international law. We had a scenario come up where a lawyer on the phone reminded us that we were violating the Fourth Amendment, and we paused briefly and were sort of entertaining, can we use math to bypass that restriction? And then the question is, should we really be using math to bypass a Fourth Amendment restriction? So you get deontological ethic frameworks are less about the techniques and more about, they're all about the techniques and the rules you use as you're modeling these situations. And are you using the best methods of your field to promote ethical analysis? That's always key. This gets to the question that Mike had touched upon, this question of, are we scientists or engineers? And one way to think of this is science is interested in, is it true, right? Do I have the actual valid answer as best we can understand it? Engineering is, does it work, right? Is it able to do what we need to do? And there's not a right or wrong answer here necessarily, but you need to be clear on this when you're talking to your client of like, hey, we're taking this as an engineering, so we're going to figure out what works. We may not know precisely why it works, but we're going to go forward with that. Or the client, if you want scientific, truth or validity, we may not have an answer at the end of this. And that's something to discuss in the process of building a model with the client so that they understand what you're presenting. The virtue ethics are about the conduct of the analysts themselves. So consequentialist is looking at the environment in which you're modeling in and the outcomes it will produce. Deontological is the rules by which you model. And virtue ethics is about the conduct of the analysts themselves, not the methods. What is your personal bias? What are the ramifications of type 1 and type 2 errors that you might make from your personal bias? This is a quote from Meadows and taken from an article by Erica Palmer. Problem definition, choice of method, boundary, and selective omission of facts about the system being modeled are the most essential assumptions of any model. So in a way, we as modelers have a huge ethical choice, whether we realize it or not, on our own, which means we have to be very conscious of our own biases, prejudices, gaps in information, or misunderstandings, and rigorously question that ourselves as well as our colleagues. Navigating agency and impacts. Who is your audience? What populations does the model impact? If you're going to model a criminal policy to help law enforcement, who are the communities it's going to impact? Who are the communities that are impacted if it doesn't work? You know, these are questions to ask. And are you listening to local agency of these populations? I call it the bed shell test. There's a movie criticism that's called the bed shell test, which is if two women in a movie have any discussion about any topic other than the love interest of either, that demonstrates at a minimum level agency of those women characters. The conflict analysis bed shell test is, are you actually have at least two local actors where you are able to articulate their agency and interest, not in relation to the foreign power. You'll often hear or read analysis that is lots of local Western politicians, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama, Trump, and then they'll refer to a country's perspective as, and Afghanistan did this, and Iran did this, and Syria did that, without getting into the agency of the actors in that country. So the bed shell test is a way of saying, at a minimum, have we considered the local agency of at least some of those actors? It's not a very sophisticated test. It's pretty simple. And should you incorporate local agency? The Sahel case that's in the archives at WPI is about restoring grasslands in Africa. And the local agents there, the local actors, had traditional practices and beliefs and approaches which were destroying the grasslands. So the question is, how do you balance that need to incorporate local agency but not necessarily be driven by the opinions of the local agents if it results in a bad outcome? And from what perspective inside the system? This is taken from Forrester's lectures that we watch in the CLM. He always would pick a perspective. Go ahead.
I have a comment since you brought the topic about Sahel. I think the book, The Electronic Oracle by Dana Meadows, is very helpful in talking about the institutional conditions under which the model was created and the modeler's goal behind building that model.
Is that Meadows and Robinson?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, yep, I've got that source listed on the page.
And very interesting about Sahel, the buildup of the model came at the very end of that project. And this was a PhD student who had to build that model and get away with his PhD. So
that creates some implications.
So I don't remember all the details, but it illustrates exactly what you're talking about. And it's described beautifully there in that book.
Well, I've got a reference here. I'm going to post these slides online afterwards, but I've got a reference here if anyone wants to pick up the Meadows and Robinson. And I know it's an assigned reading, at least in part, in some of the WPI classes. When picking the perspective of a point of view inside the model, Forrester in his market growth model picked the perspective of a he said, I can pick a shop worker, I can pick a manager, I can pick a CEO or a venture investor. And he picked the investor, I think is what it was. For emerging state actor model, we picked a perspective of regional commanders on both sides. So we picked a perspective of the theater and people who are high enough up that they're kind of allocating resources, but not able to sort of individually direct events on the ground tactically. So this perspective you pick should be thoughtful, should be determined. It shouldn't be accidental, and it should be described somewhere why you picked that perspective. The Afghanistan problem, again, this comes from Turnley, but is a great illustration of the virtue ethics when it comes to boundary selection. So we think about people in the West as organized and kinship-based, or excuse me, the clans and tribes. The reality of the tribal system is counterintuitive to the West, I should say. And so it's all this complexity and descendancy that isn't immediately apparent. We think of it, in the Westphalian system. We see Afghanistan as a nation state. It has a boundary. The boundary confines the problem. So on the left is sort of the local perception. On the right is the Westphalian perception that if we didn't, just applying the borders of Afghanistan would cause you to miss what the reality is you have this cross-border region now where the actual tribe and kin networks exist, part in Afghanistan, part in Afghanistan or Pakistan, and they're scattered around. So without sort of, when you choose your boundaries, especially if you're slicing a problem in your geographic boundaries, you have to be really careful that you're not bringing to it a personal viewpoint or point of view that may not be applicable to what you're modeling. The obligation of being an ethical voice. This is again from Turnley's presentation. You have the person with the money, right? He who makes the gold makes the rules. They're the customer and the client. They're asking you to do something or sponsoring. Then you have the domain and theoretical expert, the coder, the model builder, the data providers. They're responding to this request for analysis, and the systems integrator. And all of these have, who is the ethical voice in this diagram? Who is relied upon to be the ethical voice? In some industries like medical and things like that, this is well defined, but I would imagine in a lot of analysis and businesses and things like this, there's not really a assigned role. And should it be an assigned role, or is it everyone's responsibility? When it comes to ethical considerations, there's a lot of talk about rigor, validity, building confidence these days. There's a lot of discussion about rigor, and this was written in November, so it kind of precedes that. But validation of an analytical model or confidence building in a simulation isn't sufficient to be ethical. I think that's a very key point, is that we can't just rely on numerical techniques, pass a mark, and say we've satisfied our ethical obligation. Valid analysis can be unethical. You can come up with entirely valid analysis that passes all the mustard, but itself has an unethical outcome or unethical creation method, or unethical that will sort of taint the delivery of those analysis and what you do with them. But an ethical analysis can never be invalid. So this isn't to say you just ignore all that rigor stuff and say, I'm being ethical. Let's all, talk ethics and model whatever we want. No, you've got to be rigorous, but you've also, that's the minimum, but you also have to have the ethical perspective on top of the technical rigor.
So when you say validation, you talk about it being it is sort of a methodology. You're basically making sure the thing that you're producing against an initial set of requirements from a perspective of the consuming side, right?
Right. So there's, and this was again a discussion not just with system dynamicists, where we would have used perhaps confidence building, but in system dynamics, it's the 10 suites of confidence building. There's the 10 tests or 12 tests you do to build confidence. In statistics, there's statistical validity. Are you using the right measure? Are you using the function correctly? Have you applied, to normalize the data? Have you gotten the data appropriately? Lots of fields in analysis have methods of validation or confidence, but those alone are not ethics. Satisfying those, in my opinion at least, is not satisfying an ethical obligation. It's passing the post on reaching a certain level of maturity, and it's required and it's necessary, but it's not sufficient on its own.
I'm suggesting the typical approach to validation is more of a verification of the model as opposed to true validation by what you typically have to establish what it is you're validating. And if you include things like you're suggesting around ethics, then that'll be encompassed in your validation suite, so to speak.
I would think in an ideal world that would be the case. I would probably, being a cynical optimist, recognize that ethics does not figure in many validation approaches.
But typically you have to have typically the process for validation, the process for verification, it's inherent, it's endogenous to the type of work that we have to do. But someone has to write something up front. A lot of times when you're writing your models, you're not doing a true systems perspective in the sense of writing, like I'll call it systems engineering methodologies, not being applied to the model development. Quite often, people are developing it, they're doing aspects of it, but they're not generating an explicit set of requirements like model-based engineering.
Right, and that would be, in my mind, a deontological approach to ethics of here are the methods by which we do modeling, and one of them, and you raise a really good point, failure to be transparent. How did we, arrive at the decisions of what would go in the model? How did we arrive at the decisions of what valid would mean? And why did we make those decisions? Not just the list of the validation tests, but why we chose those tests. That is, I think, a key part of a deontological framework perspective, because it's talking about rules we follow. We will achieve ethical outcomes if we follow ethical rules. And that, I think you would find, for example, in the US court system is a very deontological approach of ethics that is sort of like, if we follow these rules, regardless of the sausage that gets crammed in there and the bizarreness of each individual case, on the whole, the outcome will be more ethical than if we don't have these rules. And so I think there's a good argument there that there probably needs to be, to the rigor Professor Radzigi was talking about, the bar has these things documented very well. The court procedures are extremely rigorous in their deontological approach, and perhaps we won't get into personal ethics of lawyers, but they do a rules-based system. If you follow these rules, the outcome will be as most ethical as we can make it. So this is a lot, though. This is a lot for people to like take in and think. And I got, to Rafat's point, I got a PhD due, and I got to get this model out the door. And how do I? From Turnley, I've borrowed at least a one-page, what I call clear the decks, and I put this. You'll see this now in most of my presentations. And what it is it at least makes that transparency. And those who saw my presentation on terrorist data last week saw this. I state my focus, who my intended audience is, my method, my perspective, my personal perspective, and what is out of boundary. Now, this is not sufficient or complete or necessarily exhaustive, but it's at least an attempt. So I would recommend for people interested in this, they include something like this when they're presenting. A lot of times we jump into models and we're looking at stocks and flows and we got fancy charts. I would have at least one slide that clears the deck, so at least people understand where you're coming from, who you're intending to talk to, what's included, what's not, at a high level before you go on to the details.
I think that's a good system. That's a good systems methodology on top of doing the systems modeling.
Right. So some more best practices continued. Challenge the process. Question your teammates. Right. We're all in this for the inquiry and pursuit of knowledge. So that questioning practices we develop, aim them at your teammates, aim them at your superiors, aim them at your colleagues, aim them at the people you're working for. Be sure to question people and allow to be questioned. Question yourself. We're in a situation with how do I phrase this delicately? I'm on a current client where questioning is not encouraged. And as a result, the outcomes are not as ideal as they could be. So there's a feedback loop. If you don't tolerate questioning, you won't necessarily get the best outcome. Document your decisions. This is to your point, Jim. Document. It's not enough just to discuss these things at a symposium. You got to have somebody there to write down what happened at the symposium and keep it in check. So I couldn't get away without, I'm here in front of a bunch of students in Germany. Not all of them are system dynamicists. I had to put in a causal loop diagram. So this is the guilty pleasure here. But the modest proposal, typically, people will pick one framework and just they're a virtue ethics. Their virtue, that's it. Or they're deontological. Like I said, the court system, it's deontological. Don't worry about consequentialism or virtue. We'll stick to the rules. I think because of how system dynamics is structured and how we deal with structure and how we deal with iterative modeling, we can actually combine all three of these frameworks into one approach. And, it starts with a balancing feedback loop of the modeling process. You have modeling choices you make that lead to the modeling methods you're going to use, that lead to the simulated and real world outcomes, that lead to the insights from the outcomes that feed back into the modeling choices. And this is over a period of time. This isn't necessarily in a short iteration, but this is the modeling process. Well, virtue ethics feeds into your modeling choices, right? This is you as the agent having an ethical perspective when you're conducting the modeling. And deontological ethics, this feeds into the modeling methods, right? You talked about, Jim, having procedures and documentations or the rules we follow, not just for technical validity, but ethical validity being built into the methods themselves. And because we simulate, we can see the consequences. This is where I think the real power of system dynamics and simulation, agent-based modeling has this too. You can see what happens, right? You should have no reason to avoid a consequentialist ethic discussion if you can see the future unfold you by the very tool you're using. And all of these are going to have, like you can see, they all have influences into the feedback, but they themselves are connected by, as you see consequences result, there should be a feedback loop to close the loop up to deontological ethics. We didn't have the right rule here that prevented an unethical outcome. How do we close that loop? Likewise, how do we close the loop of refining behaviors, things not to do to reduce error in the person themselves doing the modeling? And the two themselves have a feedback loop of generating new ethical considerations, right? Consequentialism isn't innovative, it's retrospective. It's, wow, something went wrong. Let's not do that again. Figure out. But deontological and virtue has a space for innovation if they work together to sort of think about what are the new methods we can generate? What are the new behaviors we should adopt? And so my modest proposal here was to combine all of these into a system that can then itself, the system is what generates the ethical things, not the adoption of any one ethical framework. It's the embodiment and embedment in the system of these different perspectives. Any questions on this?
Nope, that's good. I mean, I'd like to see the, yeah. I mean, I figured you were going to go to that feedback. It's really good.
Tim, thank you for creating this diagram. Unfortunately, I was driving, so I couldn't really see it.
It looks fantastic. It's the best. It's got the classic weird ovals in it, but we can clean it up. But
view the recording.
Yeah, yep. I will view the recording. So, but thank you for doing this to really put these ideas together.
Yeah, and I'm coming toward the end of here, and then there will be, I've got some cases, but we can really just have an open discussion ethics. But there's two things I wanted to get through. If you're modeling conflict, violence, and instability, this comes up. So this is something I've had to deal with. So this is a bit of a personal point, but I don't know, Mike, or Professor Radzicki, I don't know if economists are really soulless individuals who never care if they crash an economy or not, but I imagine this comes up in economics as well as when should you blame yourself and when shouldn't you? If you create a model that recommends a policy or you don't do something and something goes really wrong, how should you react to that? What is the right way? And this really comes up to me working on terrorism and mass shootings and things like that. When there's a big mass shooting, I had in the past, I would have, wow, should I have done more? Should I have helped more? What could I have done? And I actually reached out to the intelligence community because they deal with these kind of problems and say, how do you guys deal with this? I mean, you're on the front lines in the military and intelligence. And they said they have 3 things they do when something really bad happens and you're kind of in that, should I blame myself? You ask, did I have a duty to perform and I failed to perform it? The second, so if I was supposed to do something and didn't do it, that means I should accept blame. But if I didn't have a duty specifically assigned to me, and Rafat, if you could go on mute, we're getting some side chatter. If I didn't have a duty, though, it's not necessarily, I shouldn't go out and assume that it's my duty to solve all the world's problems, because it's not. I have specific duties that I'm assigned. I need to fulfill those duties. The second is, did you know something and fail to report it? Before the Paris attacks, I had done a little progress curve analysis based off train attacks in France, and it indicated that they would achieve some sort of proficiency sometime between September and February the next year. And of course the attacks happened, I think it was late November, but I didn't really know. So I was, I'm thinking to myself, wow, I didn't really know. This was a diagram I had done. It was a sketch. It happened to be a coincidence that it was doing this, but this wasn't something known that I failed to report. Had I actually known, like I'm seeing internet chatter, and I failed to report it, that's a very different type of responsibility. And then the final one is, did you have an opportunity to raise a concern to the proper official at the proper time and failed to do so? This one's probably the hardest because it involves that questioning of superiors. If you're standing in front of someone who has the authority to assign duties and to take action, and you have a concern, that is valid. I'm not saying just I'm upset at the coffee or I don't like the work schedule, but like a concern of risk, and you fail to provide it when you have that opportunity, that is something that I think at least is a missed opportunity, and you may want to be accountable. But the way they use this, they say, if you go through all of these and the answer to each of these is no, don't blame yourself. The world is a bad place. There's bad things going on. You can't solve them all. Stay focused on your job and do those things so that you're not missing it. But if the answer to all 3 of these are no, don't take it. The final piece for that I was given. Yeah, go ahead.
Something that leads to mind. That sounds like the kinds of questions that would be asked at a medical review board or a civil lawsuit for a physician, for example. Maybe even in the military. So these questions, I think, are good, and I think they're the sorts of questions that are asked of other professionals.
Good. As I said, this was information I got from the intelligence and military community, but it's good to hear. I mean, I imagine a medical after a board review of a catastrophic outcome or a fatality or something probably asks similar questions, and I just realized it might be a good source to go look at what they ask, because this is, again, they're dealing with high risk all the time.
Yeah, if you have a duty to perform, you fail to perform it. Your obligation was to check on the patient every 2 hours. And you
exactly.
And you didn't do it, and the patient died or something.
Yep. That's a very good point, that and these systems are out there. My push, or the reason I do this, is to get those systems into the analytical space writ large, or at least the system dynamic space, that these are things we adopt and embrace within system dynamics. Because a lot of the stuff, Jay Forrester, solve big problems. Well, if you're going to solve a big problem, there's a big risk. So these are important things to discuss. Also, know your limits. So what are you willing to model and what are you not willing to model? How do you handle self-care if you need it? I watch a lot of ISIS propaganda. I watch a lot of video that is not exactly nice. You got to know your boundaries and limits and what you can and can't handle, and when you say enough is enough. You can't live in this stuff, but you have to have sufficient distance and space to be able to model it. To me, these models can be weapons, and I we can talk actually that you're building a model for the military and it's going to be used for combat purposes, or metaphorically, like you're modeling a policy, but in the wrong hands. This model, one of the real dangers of these simulation models is the results, when done well, the visualization looks sexy. People are like, oh yeah, it's computerized, it's got all this math, it must be right. So they assign sort of an unconscious cachet a lot of times to the results that they wouldn't have if I just walked up to them off the street and said, hey, I got an idea, I think we should do this. So you got to be really careful that these models are like loaded weapons in some ways. Once they get picked up and handled and start moving around, there's a risk of what's going to happen with that.
Hey, Tim, can I say something related to that?
Please do.
It just reminds me of urban dynamics, and that the result was to clear out the slums, which was kind of a hot button and may be considered a weapon, right?
Exactly. I didn't know that. That's a great point. That's exactly actually what I'm talking about is, did the modelers know the implications of that, or were they just looking at grids and sort of saying, well, if we move this grid with an unfavorable characteristic, we'll get more favorable characteristics? And do you know, was that discussed, or did it only come out once the decision was made that it was a political blowback and things like that?
Well, that was his major finding, and there was a lot of pushback and a lot of controversy at the time.
Yep. Do you have a plan in place for when you get it wrong and people suffer harm? So this may be the question we can't ask Jay necessarily, but you're not going to get it right all the time. That's the big thing so the question is, what are you going to do when you get it wrong? How do you take care of yourself, or, manage personal accountability? There's legal implications. How do you navigate that? Do you have a plan in place for when you get it right and nobody knows, right? That's the opposite one. As academics, we always want to go out and publish the articles. We want to cry to the rooftop, triumph validity, but you can't do that always. So the question is, do you have self-rules in place to manage these times for things you can't talk about? And so that was just a partial biography. At this point, I'm going to pause because the rest of this is just different cases that I pulled from my own experience at IBM and elsewhere for ethical sort of cases. But if people want to have their own or discuss ethical times where or situations they've had in ethical, we can spend the rest of the time having that open discussion, or I can pick one or two of these at random and just go through them. It's up to the group what you want to do at this point.
So, Tim,
or are there questions on what I presented?
I think, Tim, so I like everything you're saying. I think in some cases, though, at least from my experience, and I don't want to say we don't have to be concerned about this, but sometimes the reason some analysis is being done, there's already a reason for it and they're looking for an answer. So it kind of overtakes the ethics, because I might want to model it from hey, you're not considering all this stuff, but they're like, no, we've decided this is the solution, tell us how it works best, even though that might not be the best solution with everything else. So, it goes into, yeah, I can say, well, yeah, before these things, I can say I know something and you're not considering it. I'm telling the right people, they don't care. And then, are you willing to model or are you unwilling to model? These are great questions in theory. In reality, if I'm not willing to model it, I could be out of a job.
But this is not a right or wrong answer. This to me is a question people should ask. Am I willing to lose my job and I'll make a stand and not model something? Or am I okay modeling something where I've been in the circumstance you've talked about with commands that are like, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're doing it. We need you to move the numbers around. And I've already made a personal choice that in the larger context of things, I'm okay doing that because there's and I can get into why, but there's a whole rationale. But for other people, that might not be sufficient. What I ask in this thing is have those conversations with yourself before you get there so that you know when that happens, you say, you know what, I'm going to do what I'm told because of my previous decisions and thinking, I want the job, or I think we're doing a greater good, or it has a better benefit for being here. That's not a wrong choice. That's just having an informed choice so it doesn't come by surprise. A lot of these young college students I was talking to in Stuttgart, they haven't been in those situations yet. And I was trying to get them to think, before you end up there in front of the CEO, know what you're going to do and where your personal lines are.
Right. And so I've struggled with this myself, and I can't get into specific details, but I mean, I have had what I believe to be a unbiased, kind of correct answer. It wasn't incorrect, but it wasn't what people wanted to hear. And I was specifically told, if you don't take this out, your name's off the report and it's getting reported up. And I was like, all right, take my name off the report because what you're going to put forward is wrong. And what ends up happening is it's still used, and the people whose names got on it now are recognized for doing actually all the good work that I did on that, and now they're given more stuff. So the people who are willing to be what I would consider unethical, and that's a harsh use of the term because they've made decisions as well. But right. I no longer get a seat at the table, and good work doesn't still get. So it's so hard.
It is very hard, and I try and be very careful that these are not multiple choice questions or yes or no. These are about trade-offs, right? The trade-off of the long-term access and the seat at the table that gives more influence that might be able to steer over time versus that immediate, desire to I can't support this. And it is a trade-off question with no real right or wrong. I've been in situations where I've been working on an investigation, and at some point I say, I now have a conflict of interest because of the way this investigation is being handled. I am going to remove myself from the case. And that had consequences for me and the case because it throws the credibility in doubt and all that stuff. But it's like, you have to decide at some point what the actions you're going to do, and can you live with those consequences? To your case, it could be a career consequence, things like that. I'm glad for sharing because I think this comes up a lot in certain environments, but it comes up a little in all environments. I don't think any environment's immune to this, but I think it comes up in certain environments quite a bit.
And another thing, back on your, if you knew something was wrong, did you speak up at the right time? Those questions. In the medical field, I can't remember what it's called or whatever, but when you're in the operating room, if somebody believes something is wrong or amiss, if you're the person that hands the scalpel to the doctor, you speak up and everybody believes you and stops until your concern is addressed and it's recognized that, yep, there's something wrong, we got to fix it, or no. And you're not held accountable in a bad way for doing that. You're expected, if you think something's wrong, to speak up. And on the military side, we have positions that are called technical warrant holders, and their job is to be there. If you think something's wrong and your chain of command isn't taking it seriously, you go to the technical warrant holder. It's an appropriate professional way for you to jump chain of command to get your concern heard. Right. So there are things that are built into the system, but these are, at least in my work, it's for the technical stuff, not for the modeling stuff. This seems that it's not recognized in the same way as a field that needs to be handled in the same way as expertise in technical fields.
Yeah, and I think, you can go back, this, especially in the military environment, there is such a culture of the chain of command, and the top person makes the call and we all fall in line. And I encounter that just in business. I mean, business stuff, I'm not talking life or death decision, but business stuff all the time. And it does come up in, you know, life and death scenarios too. And it's there for a reason. It's not that they just thought one day, well, we're going to have the top guy. I mean, there's valid reasons for having this chain of command. But to your point, even if you have an official channel, that doesn't necessarily prevent the consequence from a social ostracization. You know, there can be a lot of things done in the informal way within the military that aren't necessarily formal. And so these are just questions for people to think of and bring up and decide. Like, I know a lot of modelers, like, I will never work for the military. And I respect that, because they've said, you know what, I don't want to be put in that spot. I don't want to be in that environment. You know, my choice is different, but I respect their choice. So it's a tough spot.
Oh yeah, I've worked on projects, again, I won't get into the details, but you know, I was putting the assessment methodology together, and I kept going away from this one particular potential answer. And finally the senior officer's like, why aren't you presenting that? It's like, well, because the people who are in that plane are gonna die. And he's like, that's their job. You know, in this situation, and it really, you know, it was like a ethical brick wall that I did. It's like, I don't want to set up for people to die. And finally I was like, you know what, if they need to make this decision, it's not my decision to make. This is what the modeling says. So yeah. But yeah, so sometimes it's easy to say when you're modeling, you're talking about things in not abstract, but not individual people, but individual people will pay consequences.
So, but so that's something we have to do. I think we're going to talk about that. We have hazards and harm analysis. We do all our products, and we have to make decisions about whether or not the benefit, the clinical benefit outweighs the risk. Because you get some people, you know, some percentage of people are going to have maybe an adverse reaction because, you know, we're introducing therapeutics and they're not. Some people can have severe side effects. Typically, there's a body of safety profiles done throughout the clinical development, but somebody could have some like COVID or something like that. So in your model, your case that you were talking about, was it that there was risk associated with this person doing their job? You have to see that the risk was elevated to an unacceptable level, or you felt for you it was unacceptable in the context of.
For me, for that particular thing, we were looking at different courses of action, and I wanted a course of action where no Americans died. And that just wasn't going to happen in reality.
There's a case here, Jim, that is I have in my case file that I jumped to, which is not exactly the same, but similar, and it's the approach I took. You know, how do you model U.S. war crimes? Right? This is something very few in the military want to hear or talk about. When you're talking about deploying a large group of folks into a country with a hostile environment, and they're going to be interacting with the native population, war crimes are going to happen. The question is to what extent, how much, and what can you do to mitigate it? And this became a very big point of contention. And, you know, how we did it is, how do you model this? How do you incorporate this in your policy testing? Basically, we just made the worst case explicit, you know, and this is model structure. There's structure in the model I built whereby you have a rate, which is the war crime rate, which is at a certain percentage, which is low, but it will accumulate. If you're doing air raids, there's going to be civilian casualties, may not technically be a war crime, but it's calculated here. You may have troops that lose their discipline and lose their order. And so we built it in the model and we just made it transparent. Now, we weren't asked to remove it necessarily. That's fine. But at least it was in there, and it was visible, seeable, and it was felt to be aware of it, to say, look, there may be very good things that you deploy this group of troops, but see, as a consequence, the war crime deaths are going to go up and the refugees are going to go up as a result of, you know, refugees fleeing an area after there's been a war crime, just to make it transparent and awareness. And it was simply a way that we had, and I fortunately was not like, take this out of the model or else, but, you know, this is one way I approached it. We included, we made it visible, we made it felt, but then also recognizing the decision is not our decision to make. There's a legal authority for a reason, and there's a constitutional authority for a reason. So this is very similar to Ann's case in the ISIS model, except not American lives necessarily, but a high impact,
right.
Predictable effect. This is going to happen. You can't say it's not going to happen. You can't magically pretend it's not. Right. So how do you address it?
This is a risk profile. You just go back to the chart. So that's a risk profile. There's some preferred outcome, even in the possible view of this information here, that would be used to make a decision. And you balance those two things to get to.
Well, and my preference is that they always do trade-offs, and they say we are willing to accept an increased risk of this for a benefit of that. But the reality is, not everyone's big into trade-off analysis. Sometimes they're big into, here's the decision we're going to do, and that's your question of what are you willing to model or not model.
No, I'm saying the difference is, so maybe in the domain you're talking about, we have to explicitly provide to the health agencies. We might miss something, but we have to provide them as extensive an analysis of all the risk.
I understand that, but I think the reason I'm pushing this is there is no health agency for simulation modeling that I know of. Well, but this is the kind of discussions, the space we're in, when we talk about simulation modeling and analysis, there is no regulatory body that I know of enforcing this. There may be society codes and professional conduct codes, but I don't know. Rafat's the policy member. I don't know if the System Dynamics Society has a professional code of ethics when it comes to modeling.
No, I'm saying, but then again, what I will say, even though we have maybe some more explicit frameworks that we actually have laws by which we have to follow. There is bias in the way that you construct the body of evidence. You can bias risk to make it acceptable.
Yeah.
And there's business pressures. There are things like business pressures to do that. So even in the context of a domain where you have something.
There was another case that came up where you're in simulation. To make an accurate simulation, you'll often be asked to think like the bad guys because you need to accurately represent them. So the client had requested that both sides, the non-state actor and the state, were explicitly represented and playable in the simulation game. The goal is to learn how ISIS acts and reacts. It's a very rational goal. It's a valid goal, and it made sense, right? You want your team to understand how the other team. The problem is you have to be able to create a simulation where the bad guys win. So you get in this situation of I'm literally modeling the techniques and tactics that could be used against, and when it comes to red force, like there's red team when they do. Red team is when a group will try and break into a building, but they're doing it as part of a security test. There are frameworks around that. They try and penetrate TSA security. They try and penetrate facility security. They try and so that we know where our weaknesses are. But this kind of red team structure, I don't think exists in simulation modeling to say, hey, how do you optimize the tactics of the bad guys? And so I think these ethical discussions, there's a lot of room to grow and develop more ethical practices that could be incorporated into doctrine or things like that, especially when it comes to analysis. There's this one was McKenzie, less of a military context, but this is just the unintended consequences. McKenzie conducted an internal social media analytics, at least they said it was internal, and identified leading Twitter influences for Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, obtained the report somehow, and the influencers are now either arrested or in hiding. So here's an issue. The research was internal, right? At least according to McKenzie. It was never intended to be used in the way it was used, let alone it wasn't even intended to be outside the company. It was not designed for regimes. So the report wasn't about negative influencers. So the question is, this really gets into data walks around, data travels, data is like the old kung fu guy wandering the West looking for his brother. It gets places. So as you're building these models and these simulations, all these documentations, what controls do you have in place? What assurances do you have to make sure it doesn't get into an unintended hands? And were they even thinking about the consequences of modeling influencers in an area like, Saudi Arabia or somewhere where there may be a repercussion, or were they just thinking, hey, social media, let's go find some top influencers?
So I think this is a good example of where you're never going to be able to know if your work is going to be used in a way that you didn't intend it to be used and for malicious or whatever nefarious reasons. But you do have the power to document your work for why you intended it, what assumptions went in, and what, in the beginning, what the purpose, like you were saying, what the purpose you made the model for. Further on, if somebody changes it, morphs it, modifies it, or just uses it for different reasons, at least you have the documentation to show that this is what you developed the model for.
Yep, it's kind of like that goes back to that models can be weapons, right? You manufacture a weapon, you have to make it as safe as you possibly can. You have to produce the instructions as possibly can, and you have to somehow try and do your best effort. But a weapon can walk around. So, you know, where are your limits? Do you, you know, and that's I mean, this is a great question to end on. I want to end in that none of these are like firm answers. These are all trade-off discussions like Ann and I were talking about. I don't want to come across that there's one right answer, but I really think we need to be talking more in these terms and developing this ethical discussion and framework, just as we're talking about, you know, rigor and technical methods and stuff like that as well, for the field to have credibility going forward and to avoid a catastrophic one that gets that we are responsible for. Although it sounds like with urban dynamics, we've already had heavy impact in some ways. So
one of the things you got me thinking was, you know, and again, every case is different, but are you trying to provide an answer for a decision maker, or are you trying to inform the decision maker?
Again, are you a scientist or an engineer?
Right. So if you're trying to inform, then you can provide, okay, here's the pros and cons if you went this way, here's the pros and cons if you went this way, you know, and then the decision maker makes the decision, but you've provided, you know, at least different ways for him or her to think about the overall problem that needs to be decided upon.
Exactly. That's a good approach. And we are 5 after the hour. I want to be respectful that there's a class coming in after that. So I'll let Ann have the last word. Thanks everyone for the time today. I know it wasn't a traditional presentation, but I appreciate the time in doing this. And again, I'll put the slides up on ResearchGate, and Christine, when the video gets condensed and uploaded, we can put it out on YouTube for viewing. Thanks everyone.
Tim,
Thank
what do you
Tim.
do next?
Go ahead. Stop